Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to another wrap-up of books that I've read, not from this past week, but the week before that. This week has been Booktubeathon and I'll be doing a separate wrap-up video of what I read for the readathon probably in a couple of days. So these are things that I read before I started Booktubeathon. And before I get into all of this, just a note that I'm probably going to have very little content up on this channel for most of the month of August. I'm just going to be very busy. I'm going to be out of town. I have work stuff going on, life stuff going on, and I'm going to Worldcon in San Jose in the middle of the month. So if you're wondering where I am, go find me on Twitter or Instagram because that's probably where I'll be making most of my updates this month. The first book I have to talk about is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. This book was really big on BookTube a couple of years ago. I know a lot of people who read it and really enjoyed it, and I always meant to get around to it. I finally listened to the audiobook version after I watched one of Andrea's videos on books about death, and I thought, you know, I've put that off for far too long. I have watched some of Doughty's Ask a Mortician videos on YouTube, and I quite like her and the way she speaks and everything. So listening to the audiobook of this memoir was a really good idea because she narrates it herself and she actually does a really good job. So I call this a memoir. I don't know if maybe it's more generically nonfiction, but really I think it's her personal journey in the death industry when she began working at a crematorium and how that changed how she viewed death. And she's now an advocate for better death practices, let's say. Healthier practices for dealing with death and the dead. And that's really what this book is about, is what it was like to work in a crematorium, what she learned about the death industry, and how much she really didn't like a lot of what she saw, and how it affects people. I just finished reading this and thought, I totally get what Doughty is going for, why she believes what she does, and I think I'm one of those people who would really benefit from more conversations around death and what happens to your body after you die and how to deal with that and everything, because it's very likely I'll go through my whole life not really having to face it, and that actually makes death really scary, if that makes sense. So yeah, a thoroughly enjoyable book that definitely made me think a lot about the topic and how I personally do or do not relate to it. Next up, I read Wade in the Water by Tracy K. Smith, which is her most recent poetry collection. I picked this up because earlier in the year I read her Pulitzer Prize winning collection, Life on Mars, and I quite liked that one. Not so much because of the style of poetry, but because I liked the topics that a lot of the poems were about science and space and the death of her father, who was, I think, a NASA engineer. I really got into the topics of that poetry collection. Wade in the Water, not so much. I think a lot of the poems were found poems or erasure poems, and neither of these forms of poetry do much for me. The only piece in here that I actually really liked was one of the found poems called Watershed, I think, which is based on an article I'd actually read. I think it's called The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare or something like that. Basically, one of DuPont's facilities was poisoning the environment and the community around it, and this article was an expose on that. So half of the poem is a found poem using words from the article, and then the other part of it are pieces from people's first-hand accounts of near-death experiences, I think. And I actually really liked this Watershed poem. I'm not sure that I really care for the format of it, but the way it was put together and combining these things, and the fact that I really liked the original article it was based on, it was quite affecting. Everything else though, I don't know. I think that Smith's style of poetry just doesn't work so well for me, so I'm gonna move on and try some other poets next. Next is one of my favorite recent reads. This is An Informal History of the Hugos by Jo Walton. And this is a collection of blog posts that she wrote for Tor.com between 2010 and 2013, in which she basically analyzed the nominees and winners of the Best Novel category in the Hugo Awards to determine if, in her opinion, the Hugo voters had really selected works that in retrospect were the best of the year, indicative of the quality of the year, and representative of where the field was at that time. And Walton, I think, is an excellent person to do a project like this. As the title suggests, this is not a professional, academic, scientific, quantitative assessment. This is a casual, informal, personal opinion type project. But Walton has both the breadth and the depth of reading experience in the field to actually make some of these comparisons and to approach it as a fan and a reader would, rather than a critic or a professional reviewer or something. Overall, I loved reading this. It was exactly what I wanted, and it delivered a bunch of stuff I wasn't expecting. Not only does it have Walton's comments on the Best Novel category, she actually runs through all the nominees and winners in all the other categories as well, plus the Campbell Award for Best New Writer, because that's a really interesting way to see how authors were kind of picked in the early years of their career and how some people were completely missed who have become big names since then. So there's all that stuff, not just the Best Novel category, and then there was also this decision to include comments that people left on the original blog posts online, which was great because most of the ones they kept in here are from Gardner Dozois and Rich Horton, contributing their thoughts and recommendations about the short fiction categories, which is a wealth of information. It's so great. I wrote down so many reading recommendations. I think I have a list of over 100 things just from a preliminary read through the book. I'm sure I'm going to go back through it and pick more things out of it. But I think that the reason that I totally loved this and the idea of it is it just provides so much context for the Hugo Awards. I have gone through and read all of these shortlists before, and I'm familiar with a lot of the titles in the Best Novel category over the years, but all this stuff happened decades before I was born in some cases. I just don't know that much about what else was being published at the time, what wasn't considered, what should have been considered, and Walton has read so many other things from these years that she's able to pull in other titles and say, this was published this year, it didn't make it onto the short list, and that's astounding in retrospect. So all the little things, guys, it's great. It's such a, pretty much a beast of a book, and it was such a great read. So then, moving on to something completely different, Henry IV Part 1 by William Shakespeare. I have already hauled this and Part 2 recently, and I think I said in that video that I expected the histories by Shakespeare to be kind of dry and boring, and they're turning out to be absolutely not boring. They've been very interesting and I've enjoyed them a lot. So Part 1 of Henry IV. So this is, I don't know, like a decade or two after Henry deposed Richard II in the play Richard II. I don't remember enough from that play because I read it like a year ago. But now, essentially the conflict is that the Percy family, who supported Henry IV in his deposition of Richard II, feel like they are not being treated nicely enough by him. So they decide to lead a rebellion against him. And there's a lot of father-son relationships. There's Henry's relationship with his eldest son and heir, Prince Hal, who is kind of the partying wild child who isn't doing anything worthwhile, and Henry is concerned that he will make it terrible king. And then you have Hotspur, or Henry Percy, and he's exactly the type of high-achieving son that Henry wishes he had. There's actually a bit in the beginning where he talks about how he wishes that their sons had been swapped and Hotspur were his son rather than Hal, which, ouch. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I really liked the characters. I did not, however, like Falstaff. I didn't know until I started reading the Henry IV plays that Falstaff was such a famous character of Shakespeare's, like one of his most popular characters ever, and I don't like him. I think he's supposed to be like comedic relief, and I don't find anything about Falstaff to be funny, and I didn't really care about those scenes. And yeah, it does provide some contrast, you know, and some kind of shock when Prince Hal finally turns away from Falstaff and becomes the serious king he needs to be, but for the most part I didn't care about Falstaff. So next up is The Great Passage by Shion Miura. I'm not sure how to say her name. This is translated from Japanese by Juliet Winters Carpenter. Most of it's focused on this one young man who is practically shanghaied into the dictionary department of this publishing company to replace someone who's leaving. Their staff is practically skeletal, and they're very much in need of another person who is suited to the very particular task of compiling a dictionary. He turns out to be perfect for it. He's also a real odd duck. And then he's there for decades. He eventually marries a woman who is just as peculiar as he is in many ways, and it's both his experience and then other younger people around him seeing him after the very long process to get this pet dictionary made. I'm not really sure what the point of the book is, however. Is it about making dictionaries, which I thought was actually quite interesting, especially because this dictionary is for the Japanese language. But the people themselves, I'm not sure what the point of some of their stories were, other than maybe even if you are a geek and a nerd and not so good with people and a little antisocial, you can still find the perfect person for you, maybe? I don't know. I really don't know what to say about this book. I liked it, but I don't know if I got much out of it in the end, but it was a fun read at the time, so I don't know, has anybody else read this, and what do you think it was about? Because I'm not really sure. And next is Aegypt by John Crowley, another book that I don't think I can explain much about what's actually happening in it. But this book is just so intellectual and abstract and complex and layered and like nested. I think the core of it comes back to this quote that's at the beginning of the introduction, L.P. Hartley's, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there." In this book, a 30-something man, an intellectual professor type named Pierce Moffat, has this epiphany that in the ancient past, the physical world actually worked differently. Like the rules of physics were different then, and that the way that people described the world was actually the way it was. Just this idea that we have forgotten how the world actually worked in the past, but you can still find hints and fragments and glimpses of it if you know where to look. It's a really hard idea to grasp, and the character himself takes multiple tries at explaining what he means before it really clicks, I think even for him. So essentially, he's having a midlife crisis. He's pretty much lost his job as a professor, and he wanders off to a failed job interview, stumbles into a friend slash former student in this little country town, and decides to uproot and move there and work on this book which basically sounds like a bunch of astrological mumbo jumbo to a lot of people, but he has this idea. And interspersed with that, there's also perspectives from a woman named Rosie who lives in this little town where he goes, and she's going through a divorce, and she's reading these books by a man named Fellows Craft, who wrote historical fiction of a very particular kind of odd type. And it turns out that these books, which she's reading and which snippets of them are in this text, were the same books that Pierce read when he was a child and kind of formed him and fired off his imagination at that time. But there are two things that dragged this down that made it sometimes a rather unpleasant read. The first is Pierce himself. I didn't like him, and I think his particular character type is a cliche and a stereotype today. He is a 30-something white man going through a very intellectual midlife crisis. He has the drug addiction story, he has the failed relationships with women story, and he's drifting aimlessly, and honestly it feels like he's very privileged, and this sort of thing is happening to him because he's kind of privileged, and I don't know. He was boring and he got on my nerves. The second thing is that this book overall didn't feel concrete enough. There was very little solid ground to stand on in the book and figure out how the pieces actually fit together. I think that that's what it needed. It needed a little bit more explanation of how all the various parts were actually related. I do get this hazy sense that it is all connected, it is all part of one story, but it could have been clearer. So I found it intriguing at parts and very off-putting in others, so I will try to read the next one. I think it's called Love and Sleep, Love and Death, or something like that. We'll see what I think about it. If it's the same thing all over again, I probably won't finish it, but I feel like I should give this one more shot. So the last thing I have to talk about is my reread of Nation by Terry Pratchett. I first read this book when it came out about a decade ago. I think it actually came out in 2008. And I couldn't really have told you before what I thought about the book other than I remembered vaguely what it was about. So Nation is about a young man who is the only survivor of a massive wave that destroys the island called the Nation that he lived on. Everybody dies, his entire family, everybody that he ever knew, and he has to survive. And eventually he also meets up with a young white woman who's also been stranded there from the same storm, and they kind of join forces, and despite the incredible differences between them, they become very good friends, they become very close. This book is, I think, kind of at the core of it about religion, about one's belief in God or gods, and maybe loss of faith. Mainly in that Mao kind of rages against his gods who talk to him, that they could have let this happen. Like what was the point of this happening, that he has to lose everyone? And it's grappling with that kind of survivor's guilt and that loss and that heartache and the kind of PTSD of that situation. And also issues of colonialism. So there are lots of kind of thorny issues raised in this about religion and race and everything. So yeah, I don't know if I have anything else intelligent to say about this book, just that it was much more affecting this time around, and I'm really glad that I reread it. And that is everything from me this week. I will be back soon with my Booktubeathon wrap-up. I read a bunch of good books for that, so be looking forward to that. And otherwise, let me know if you have read any of the books that I talked about today. Leave me your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. And until then, bye.